Johnny and Megan are at absolute rock bottom, but they were about to get a big break. Megan was contacted by a local, very successful real estate agent named Todd Kohlhepp to somewhat unbelievably offer her and her husband pretty decent paying jobs. And so, of course, Megan and Johnny say yes. And then she and Johnny made their way out to this property. 3 days later, Megan's mother tried to get in touch with her, but she couldn't. And so something in her gut tells her that something is wrong here, and so she called the police. The police began their investigation by speaking to Todd Kohlhepp, but when they spoke to Todd, he said, look, I had limited interaction with them. They came out, they cleaned these 2 buildings on my property, and then I paid them and they left. And so at this point, the police decide their best bet is just to wait and see what happens. But a couple of days went by and the couple did not reemerge, and then a couple of weeks went by, and then a couple of months went by, and it wasn't long before the case went cold. But it would not stay cold for very long. 8 months after the Coxies were reported missing, 2 more residents of Spartanburg went missing as well. Kayla and Charlie stopped returning text messages or answering phone calls. The police finally obtained a search warrant that would allow them to look at their respective cell phone records. Her last known location was inside of the same 95-acre plot of land that the Coxies had been in before they went missing. The police put in for a search warrant, and at the same time, another group of police officers went to Todd Kohlhepp's house. At the same time, the team of police officers were kind of grilling Todd at his house. The other team that was outside of the 95-acre property, they found out their search warrant had been granted. And so they got out their metal cutting saws and their bolt cutters, and they began cutting into all of these locks and chains. And when they finally got that door open, they were absolutely astounded at what they saw inside. Police had just discovered Kayla. She was in rough shape and she had a metal chain wrapped around her neck that was anchored to the wall, and she was handcuffed, but she was alive. Kayla says she was contacted by a friend of hers, Todd Kohlhepp, and he told her that he was still looking for people to clean up the property. Kayla would tell Charlie, and Charlie, just being a good boyfriend, said, you know what, I'll tag along with you. And as soon as the couple is standing in front of Todd just casually pulls out a gun and shoots Charlie. Todd aims the gun at Kayla and says, if you go anywhere, I will kill you and I will kill your family. So he brings her inside, he locks her up, and for 65 days, she would remain his prisoner. Todd would once or twice a day come down and do whatever he wanted with her. Kayla truly did not expect ever to be rescued. They immediately radio over to the other team that were still at Todd Kohlhepp's residence, and they tell them, hey, this is what Kayla just told us. Todd's reaction to this news was also captured on video.
We have Kayla. She has told us that you shot and killed Charlie.
I didn't shoot anybody, sir.
Okay, why did you lock her in a container in your property?
I was stopped.
She's saying you buried Charlie's body on that property.
No, sir. I'm gonna need an attorney.
He would eventually confess not only to killing Charlie and kidnapping Kayla, but also to killing Johnny and Megan Coxie. Charlie, Johnny, and Megan's bodies would all be discovered in shallow graves right outside of that shipping container. Todd told police after he had confessed to these murders that he could actually confess to even more murders. Back in 2003, he had walked into a motorbike shop and killed 4 of their staff members. He had blatantly admitted to Kayla when she was in captivity that his body count was in the high 2 digits. Todd was ultimately sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences, which means he'll spend the rest of his life in prison. Jim was a part of a 20-person climbing party from Seattle, Washington. Their plan was to go to Mount St. Helens, hike up above the tree line, pick a spot, and then ski back down again. So the group arrives at Mount St. Helens, they hike up the mountain, and Jim says to the group, hey, why don't I ski down a little ways, and I'll take a picture of you guys as you pass, and then I'll follow you down to the bottom. He skis down a little ways and then turns left into an area called Dog's Head. But as soon as he turned left into that area, he was out of view of the main group. So after a few minutes, they head down and they make that left. But when they bank around the corner, Jim's not there. And so someone said, well, maybe he got annoyed with us because we were taking so long to get ready up there and he just already went to the bottom. And so they agreed that's what he did. And so they got back together again and they headed down to the bottom. But when they got to the bottom, Jim wasn't there. And so they sat there for a few extra minutes looking up at the mountain, and they're kind of scanning down at the bottom, and they're looking all over the place, but there's no sign of Jim. And so the group started to get really worried, and they contacted authorities. The first search team arrived. They found Jim Carter's ski tracks. They were total straight lines, like he was not trying to slow down. In fact, he was trying to go as fast as he possibly could, and at some point he began leaping over these huge ice crevasses that if you mistimed, it's a death sentence. And then his tracks got all the way to the edge where it overlooked Ape Canyon, and he went flying off. 75 people combed the entirety of Ape Canyon, and finally, after 10 days of finding no trace of Jim Carter, the search was terminated. The only rational thing investigators could point to was he was diabetic and he had forgotten his insulin that day, so perhaps he became hypoglycemic and then managed to ski off the cliff into Ape Canyon, where he landed in such a way that he remained hidden. Or, like the head of the search party seems to think, he was being pursued, and then presumably whatever forced him off the edge went down and scooped him up and took him away. But unless someone finds some other piece of compelling evidence, we will probably never know for sure what happened to Jim Carter. Paul told Tim and Max that if they wanted to find some real treasure, they would have to go looking inside of the abandoned hospital. So the boys drove their bikes the couple of miles over to where this hospital was. Once all three of them got inside, they decided, we're gonna go in the basement. And what they see is just deep, dark, murky, standing water. Paul finally says, I'm going. He takes his first step into the water, and before long, he says he's reached the basement floor and he's up to his chest in this disgusting water. And he says, you can't see down either hallway. At this point, Tim and Max feel compelled to go down there with their friend. They wade their way over next to Paul. As the boys were standing in the middle of the hallway, not making any moves in either direction, they suddenly hear something down the far right side of the hallway. And they shine their lights and they realize their view's completely obstructed, and whatever's made this sound, they can't see it. It's blocked by the generator and the filing cabinet. And as they're shining their lights, they still can't see anything. They hear a massive splash, like someone cannonballed at the far end of the hallway. The boys do not stick around. They immediately turn around, they run all the way back to their bikes, and they're sitting there heaving, and they look at each other and they start laughing. Paul says to Tim and Max that they should totally go back in there. It's silence inside of the basement. And then Paul, out of nowhere, takes his flashlight and throws it into the water. Paul turns to Tim and Max and says, the reason I threw it is now we have to go in because I have to get my flashlight. He takes a deep breath and he goes under the water. He immediately hears the muffled screams of Tim and Max up on the surface. He feels one of them yank on his shirt. He comes out of the water and he turns and he sees Tim and Max booking it for the stairs. He can hear the sound of something huge swimming up the hallway towards him. For a brief second, he raises his flashlight. This dark silhouette lying horizontal in the water is violently swimming up the hall towards him. Paul turns and runs towards the stairs, and they run all the way out to the break in the fence where they hop on their bikes and they bike away. The boys believe it was an alligator living in the basement of this hospital, but they never found out for sure. They never went back to that hospital. 37-year-old Carl Herrick and his cousin Henry decided to go to West Townshend to do some deer hunting. The pair got separated, and Henry spent some time yelling for Carl and looking around for him, but he couldn't find him. And Henry waited around for a little while for Carl, but he had this sinking feeling that something was wrong, and so relatively quickly, he left to get police. For 3 days, they combed the entire area, and there was just not a sign of Carl anywhere. On the third day, Henry discovered Carl's body. He was lying motionless face down in a clearing in the woods. Carl was deceased. However, there weren't any obvious injuries to Carl's body. He had some minor scratching on his arms and on his hands, but that was about it. Henry looked around the area and he found Carl's rifle that was loaded leaning up against a tree 70 feet away from where Carl was. Next to his rifle on the ground was an expended shell casing. Also, around Carl's body were apparently huge bear tracks. The official cause of death was baffling. Carl apparently was squeezed to death to the point where his rib broke and punctured his lung. The theory became Carl must have been out here by himself. He encountered a black bear. He fired one shot at the black bear. Thinking it was down, he walked over to check, and the bear attacked him and squeezed him and killed him. The end. But not so fast. Very rarely is one shot going to be enough to put down a black bear, and Carl, being a hunter, he would know that. Why would he risk his life by checking on the animal to make sure it's down without his gun? But even if all of that happened, that Carl, unarmed, approached this bear thinking it was dead, black bears don't squeeze people to death, and Carl only had light scratching on his wrists and on his hands. He did not have any signs of a traditional bear attack. So either this is the first time in the history of black bears that a black bear squeezed a person to death, or something else squeezed Carl. But what kind of an animal is so strong it can squeeze a man's chest to the point where it breaks his ribs? It makes you wonder. Peggy and her 3 kids moved in with Pie and his 2 kids. Just a couple of months later, Peggy was about to walk up to one of her tables when she noticed her heart was racing. Her legs were tingling, and so were her arms. Peggy slipped out the back door and she drove back home. Peggy's son, Dwayne, came home from high school, and when his mom rolled over to face him, her face was pale, she was sweating, she was gritting her teeth, and it looked like she was in a lot of pain or some sort of discomfort. Dwayne began telling his mom that you gotta go to the hospital. And so Pie would have to literally carry her into the hospital. She no longer could talk. She was just moaning in agony. None of their tests have revealed anything is wrong with her, and so they're at a loss. Her symptoms did not get any better. They got worse and worse and worse. Peggy's son, Dwayne, and Peggy's stepson, they were both admitted for exhibiting these same symptoms. A neurologist, he noticed something about her condition, and he suddenly realized that he knew what was going on. Next day, the results came back, and all 3 tested positive for this condition that the neurologist had guessed. For Peggy, it was too late. And so that day, the doctors went to Peggy. They would tell her, you're gonna die. The only thing we can do is try to save your boys. Peggy would slip into a coma, and then Peggy's family had to make the heart-wrenching decision to pull her off life support. Dwayne would make a full recovery. As for Travis, he would never walk normally again. Even though the actual medical condition that killed Peggy and nearly killed Dwayne and Travis was completely known at this point. Everybody knew what it was. What nobody could figure out was why this happened. Why in the world did this happen to these people? It made no sense. However, shortly after Peggy's death, that mystery would actually begin to unravel in the most bizarre and totally roundabout way. I would get ruled out as a suspect fairly quickly. He would say that 3 months before Peggy got sick, their family received a death threat. He opened the mail one day and there was this typed out note that said, your family needs to leave Florida in the next 2 weeks or you're all gonna die. But Pie thought it was some stupid teenage prank, and so he didn't think anything of it. They had no other suspects. And so they just began focusing on who might have written this note. And that's where Sherry comes in. There is an international organization called Mensa. This organization is a highly exclusive society for the ultra intelligent. A new genius was accepted into the ranks. Her name was Sherry Gwynn. She wanted to make friends with 2 members, and they were Diana Carr and Diana's husband, George Trapal. Sherry would be a near constant in George and Diana's lives. Diana and George just so happened to live right next door to Peggy and Pie's house. Sherry Gwynn wasn't even her real name. Her real name was Susan Gillette. Susan was actually an undercover police officer. She had been sent undercover after the police discovered Diana and George were responsible for that death threat letter that was sent to Peggy and Pie. It would turn out Diana and George hated Peggy, Pie, and their kids. And as he's seeing his wife getting more and more frustrated with their neighbors, George finally decides he's gonna take drastic action. And he put lethal doses of thallium in 8 different Coca-Cola bottles, and then he snuck over and he placed these Coca-Colas, and that was it. Peggy drank way more than anybody else. George would be sentenced to death. As for his wife, Diana, she would eventually divorce George and move on with her life and remarry. A veteran police officer named Josh Thomas was gonna be working at the Capital City Theater. At some point in the night, Josh comes over the radio and says, hey, I need backup right now. Someone has broken into the theater. And when Dave gets to the theater, Dave would say that Josh's eyes were, like saucers. He looked terrified. He said that he had been doing security rounds and he had heard what sounded like voices when he was in the basement. He checked all the rooms, everything was shut. And when he made his way up to the 3rd floor, he saw that the elevator had kicked on. It was in the basement, and suddenly the light was on and it was whirring up to the 3rd floor. And when the elevator opened up, there was no one there. And then the alarm goes off. That's when he called in for backup. They clear the whole theater, no one's there. They go into the main auditorium where the stage is, and they're just standing on the stage chatting with each other. And Josh is facing Dave. Josh just suddenly stopped, looking just beyond Dave's shoulder. And Josh goes, there's something behind you. Dave slowly turns around. He can tell immediately what Josh is looking at. Standing in the very back of the theater away from them is a man standing in the corner with its hands by its sides. Its back is to them and it's looking down with a hood over its head. Dave turns his whole body around to look at this thing right as this thing turns around real quick and looks directly at them. It has these deep, dark, sunken eyes and its face looks like it had been very badly burned, and it's looking at them before it just turns and runs out the back of the theater. Josh believed that that was an intruder. Dave was fairly certain that that was just another example of this entity that haunts the theater. But they would search the building and they could never find that cloaked figure again. Dave would do some additional digging on the history of the theater. It would turn out that in the 40s there was this horrible fire and a man had been trapped in the basement when the fire had erupted. And he had died inside of the theater. And so Dave would share this information with Josh. They believed that what they were witnessing was the ghost of that man who died in that fire.